John Lennon and George Harrison first met in the late 50s when Harrison joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, along with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, which later of course became the Beatles. Many would describe the early years of Lennon and Harrison's relationship as Lennon acting like a guiding figure for Harrison. But this may not have been the case for George.
But he said that you idolised him as a young boy, that you thought...
Well, that's what he thought.
And you didn't?
Well, I liked him very much. He was a groove. He was a good lad. But at the same time, he misread me. He didn't realise who I was. And this was one of the main faults of John and Paul. They were so busy being John and Paul, they failed to realise who else was around at the time.
In 1965, Lennon and Harrison found something that profoundly increased their bond: LSD. Both musicians found that it really impacted their music and personal lives. LSD really facilitated a deeper connection between the pair, as they explored altered states of consciousness and brand new perspectives on life and art. This shared experience was reflected in their music, with albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's showcasing the psychedelic influences that defined this period. The two shared their first LSD trip together after their coffees were spiked at a dinner party, a crucial bonding shared experience for them.
It felt like the elevator was on fire and that we were going into hell or something. But we were all in hysterics and like crazy. And then we got out to the top and everything was okay, and I suppose, and we sat there probably for hours and hours. I ended up driving everybody home. It was like daylight, and I was driving this Mini with John and Cynthia and Patty in it, and we were going like, I seem to remember we were doing 18 miles an hour, and I was really concentrating, because some of the time it just felt normal, like as though everything was okay, and then before you knew where you were, suddenly it was all crazy.
As the Beatles' fame grew, so did the pressures and strains on their relationships. By the late 1960s, the dynamics within the band had become increasingly fraught. Lennon and McCartney were of course the primary songwriters for the band, often relegating Harrison to a secondary role. This hierarchical structure led to growing frustrations for Harrison, who felt his creative contributions were undervalued. This frustration is well documented. He told Rolling Stone, for example, how difficult it was to get in on the act because of Paul's pushiness. He said you'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours. This clip from the Dick Cavett Show sort of explains this.
You might have been the most anxious of the four to get out. I get that impression from reading about it.
Maybe, yeah.
I wonder
it was
why.
Well, because over the years, I had such a lot of songs mounting up that I really wanted to do, but I only got my quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. Mm-hmm. And that way I would have had to have recorded about 100 Beatle albums just to get out the tunes I had in 1965.
Were you held down by the other fellas?
Well, very subtly, yes.
Many take this to be the primary reason for Harrison famously leaving the band, as seen in the Get Back film. However, the reason for Harrison's departure could be down to an altercation with Lennon. The tension between the two came to a head during these sessions at Twickenham. Perhaps the tension was due to Harrison's tiredness of Yoko Ono. Music journalist and Beatles expert David Stubbs pointed out that since the LSD use, the pair had become significantly close. However, Yoko had taken George's place in John's affections, and the two essentially lost touch. That was hurtful for Harrison. Or perhaps the tension was down to George somewhat taking over John Lennon's role in the band, while he was struggling with addiction issues. In 1968, as Lennon was re-emerging from his slump, he wrote and recorded Revolution, intended to be the next single from the Beatles. However, Harrison and McCartney vetoed it because it was too slow, according to them. This initial version by John Lennon of Revolution would appear as Revolution 1 on the White Album. Lennon had this to say about it: "But because they were so upset over the Yoko thing and the fact that I was becoming as creative and dominating as I had been in the early days, after lying fallow for a couple of years, it upset the apple cart. I was awake again and they weren't used to it. So perhaps there was some leftover tension from all of that." Whatever the underlying tensions or reasons are, it all came to a head in January 1969, where the pair supposedly had a physical altercation, according to George Martin anyway. See, George Harrison denied that they ever had a physical altercation, as did Lennon. But George Martin insisted to biographer Philip Norman that there was a physical fight just out of the frame of the cameras. Martin said that the fight was completely hushed up at the time. I don't know, what do you think? I mean, it's a bit of an odd thing for Martin to just make up, isn't it? Lennon does, after all, have a history of being violent, unfortunately. And there was significant tension between the two. And I know what you're about to do. I know you're about to write a comment that says, in the Get Back film, John and George are seen laughing about the newspaper article about their fight. And yes, that is true. However, the pair knew that they were on camera at that point. George Martin said it was all hushed up. So maybe Lennon and Harrison were told to act that way on camera, to sort of brush the fight under the carpet. George Harrison later admitted, it was a very, very difficult, stressful time, and being filmed having a row as well was terrible. I got up and I thought, I'm not doing this anymore, I'm out of here. So that shows that they were very aware of the cameras. Obviously, we can never know if there was a fight or not. But these differing opinions just go to show the cracks that were forming in the Beatles. And whether it was this supposed fight or another reason, Harrison did leave the band at that point. Lennon adopted a good riddance attitude and almost immediately suggested getting Clapton in to replace him. He's just as good and not such a headache, Lennon would say. 10 days after Harrison left, he was asked back. He agreed on two conditions. Firstly, they move out of Twickenham and they cancelled the proposed comeback live show which was scheduled for the end of the Let It Be sessions. This all seemed to work out great as the Beatles produced some of their greatest work before their eventual split, Abbey Road and the White Album. In the years leading up to Lennon's death, the relationship between him and Harrison became more strained. Harrison felt particularly hurt by Lennon's dismissive attitude towards him and the other Beatles in interviews during the mid-1970s. Lennon often downplayed the contributions of his former bandmates, which exacerbated existing tensions. Despite this, there were moments of reconciliation. For example, George Harrison would contribute his guitar playing services to a couple of tracks on Lennon's Imagine record. Tensions, while very much in the background, were still present, however. In December 1974, George Harrison was on his ill-fated Dark Horse tour, and Lennon's partner at the time, May Pang, wrote in her book, Loving John, about an altercation that happened between the pair backstage at one of the shows. She writes about Harrison confronting Lennon, asking why he wasn't there for him. Harrison apparently threw Lennon's glasses to the ground in a fit of rage. According to May Pang, the next day Harrison was very apologetic and the pair carried on like nothing had happened. And that really seems to be a theme throughout the relationship of all the Beatles. They all seem to have their mood swings, but underneath it all was this underlying sense of respect and love, like siblings having squabbles. Another one of those mood swings was George Harrison's autobiography, which proved to be a bit of a sore point between Lennon and Harrison.
In an interview before his death, John Lennon said he was really hurt by you, that you had never mentioned in your autobiography any of the influence that he had on you.
He was annoyed because I didn't say that he had written one line of the song Taxman. But
did you tell him that?
Well, I didn't, because he was already dead after that. But the point to that was that I also didn't say how I wrote 2 lines to Come Together or 3 lines to Eleanor Rigby. You know, I wasn't getting into any of that. I think in the balance I would have had more things to be niggled with him about than he would have with me.
The final time they met was a couple of years before Lennon's death. The exact date is unknown, but Harrison recalls visiting John in New York at the Dakota. By the time of Lennon's death in 1980, the pair had unfortunately become all but estranged.
The thing is, I hadn't seen him for so long. I mean, for all I know, he could still be there now, you know, because I didn't see him for 2 years anyway. And occasionally maybe he'd send a postcard. So to me, I can't get sad. I'm sad by, you know, I can't go and have play guitars with John. But then I did that anyway. I did that for, you know, a long time. So, you know, we'll meet again somewhere down the line.
Spurred on by the sad news, George Harrison felt inspired to revisit a track he had initially written for Ringo Starr. It was called All Those Years Ago. The song was repurposed by Harrison after Lennon's assassination. The rewritten version reflected Harrison's grief and his memories of Lennon. In recording the song, Harrison enlisted the help of fellow Beatles, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. McCartney, along with his wife Linda and the rest of Wings, provided backing vocals, while Starr played the drums. The lyrics to All Those Years Ago really paid tribute to Lennon's life and legacy, showing Harrison's admiration for Lennon's contribution to music and impact on the world. The song was released in May 1981 as a single and later included on Harrison's album Somewhere in England. It received positive reception and became a commercial success, reaching the top 10 in several countries. Lennon and McCartney, of course, went through a very similar thing after the Beatles broke up. They even wrote diss tracks about each other. And you can click here to watch the full story of all of that.